actually the diagnosis we were given, and this was, nearly 30 years ago, was that it was terminal and incurable and untreatable. Those were the three words that we used on diagnosis. That was the start of a very, very different journey. I was working in television at the time in the UK. I just moved out to the countryside, to the Cotswolds, and with my husband, and we had a pretty idyllic life. And in that moment, those three words just shattered it completely. So we started this journey of being carers, and it's a tough gig. It really is. And a major life change. But my initial thoughts were, I think I was very aware that I started my grief in those moments. I was aware of anticipatory grief, even if I couldn't name it, or living grief. I realized my first point of grief was that diagnosis. But I also realized I wanted to learn everything I possibly could about how do we survive this as a family? How do I survive it personally?
Hello, my grieving friend. It's Lisa. Whether you're a longtime listener or you're tuning in for the first time, welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm so glad you're here. By now, you likely know I'm passionate about exploring the nature of grief. As a narrative therapy trained social worker, a grief activist, and a widow, I'm dedicated to helping us learn to be in relationship with our grief instead of running from it. In our modern culture, we've pushed grieving into the shadows, something to be experienced privately, causing us to suffer unnecessarily and in isolation. Grief is our human inheritance. It offers us medicine if we tend to it as a community. So together with my extraordinary guests, and this season answering your questions too, we're changing the narratives of grief, one conversation at a time. You are in for such a treat today because I'm bringing you a magical conversation I just had with my amazing British friend, Lizzie Pickering. Lizzie is a grief educator, author, and a bereaved mom. She offers grief guidance to organizations and individuals, educating people about grief and helping them back to life and work following major losses from bereavement to diagnosis, divorce, even workplace changes. That's something she and I have in common. She's also the author of a gorgeous book, When Grief Equals Love, which explores her own story of the death of her son, Harry, along with powerful interviews of people who've experienced all types of losses and how they've learned to continue the bonds and relationships with their loved ones decades later. Today, we explored loss related, yes, to the death of her son, Harry. We also touched on the grief she felt as a young girl, but couldn't explain why until her mom revealed she had experienced 2 stillbirths with her siblings prior to Lizzie's birth. Lizzie brings light to the importance of staying present and curious to the changing nature of our relationship to grief and our relationship to our loved ones years, even decades later. If you've ever wondered or worried that your grief is too much or lasting too long, well, this conversation is here to reassure you that it's not. Lizzie and I want you to know that your grief is welcome here. Lizzie, welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. What an absolute delight to have you join me today.
I just wish we could be in person, but we're across
I
the
know.
pond, aren't we, from each other?
Exactly. We're across the pond, although Lizzie knows off air I've planted a little seed about us maybe doing a collaboration, IRL. So you never know, listeners. Stay tuned and follow our work for that. Well, listeners
Absolutely.
heard at the top of the show a lot about your story, a little, or not a lot, I should say. They heard a little bit about your story, about Harry, about the work that you do as a grief educator and author. And we're going to dive deep into some of the themes, especially that you talked about in your gorgeous book, When Grief Equals Love, today. I think particularly interested in exploring the long term perspectives of grief and
Mm.
continuing bonds theory and how we think about that, and maybe a little bit about cumulative losses and how we show up and hold space for ourselves in
Yeah.
that. I hoped to ground our conversation where I ground all of my conversations, and that's inviting us to unpack where did we gather our grief beliefs that we hold and how were they helpful when we faced a profound loss in our adult lives. So, can you think about an early memory of loss in your childhood and what were the adults teaching you in a way, explicitly or implicitly, about what grief is? Yeah.
One of my first memories of loss was actually finding out that I wasn't an only child. I
Mhm.
grew up as an only child, but when I was 10, I found out that I actually had two stillborn siblings who were named and christened, and my mother had seven miscarriages as well before them. And
Wow.
so I actually had all these siblings that didn't make it. And, I remember actually feeling a profound sense of relief because I had never felt like an only child, but I could never quite work out
Mhm.
why that was. But it was such a deep feeling inside me. And, and when my mum told me, I'd actually been looking through photo albums to see if I could find any photos of my mum pregnant with me, because I went through a period thinking I was adopted. And
Mm,
in the end, I asked her, and she said no, there weren't any photos of her pregnant because obviously that felt like a bad omen to her to ever have a photo
yeah.
taken of her pregnant. And I didn't know about these siblings. So that was my very first experience, I think. And,
Yeah.
and it was interesting because I felt their presence so strongly. I always
Mm.
had in a way. I don't mean in a spooky way, but in a
Yeah.
just a knowledge of their existence somehow.
Yeah.
And I have never felt like an only child since. I've always
Mm.
acknowledged their existence in some way and named them. They were Edward and Mary, with a boy and the girl who preceded me. And so they were children that I never met. And it's meant in my grief work, I always hold people very close who, may have had pregnancies
Yeah.
that didn't work out,
Yes.
who've had stillborn babies, who have been through that because I witnessed it with my mother, and although she went on to have me, she always said never a day went by when she didn't think about those other
No.
babies. So that was my first
Yeah.
lesson, I think, was that grief lasts and that you don't have to have known somebody to be able to grieve them and celebrate them.
Yeah. Oh, well, first of all, I just want to like welcome Edward and Mary into the conversation and just be present to your siblings and
Yeah.
reflect how powerfully is that you honored. You sort of chuckled, not chuckled, but sort of dismissed it off like it's not spooky. But I think that's part of our challenge is we have these intuitive knowings. And I think modernity, culture, whatever, however you want to think about it, has sort of tried to strip us from our sense of that we have a knowing about something.
Yeah.
And I am so sort of grateful on behalf of young Lizzie, 10-year-old Lizzie, that you were affirmed in a way by your mom being willing to share the stories
Yeah.
that I knew something, I know something, and that allowed you to be present to a kind of grief that you knew inside but didn't have explanation or words for. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
And it's so
I'm curious.
important. Sorry, I was going it's so
Yeah,
important in our grief work, isn't it, that we acknowledge the people that have been through pregnancies and often don't
yes.
go on to have another child. And I have many friends who are in that situation and clients. And that's a very deep loss, isn't it? But it's an invisible one.
It's very invisible or disenfranchised is kind of, as you know, the term that we often use.
Mm.
I've had my very dear friend Autumn Campbell on the show to talk about the grief over her stillbirth, and I same have so many friends, and my mom actually comes from a family where her mom had so many stillbirths and miscarriages before they adopted her, and then went on to have her sister. I'm curious too. So, holding first, let me just name holding everyone who's listening who feels that their grief of experiencing stillbirth or a miscarriage, or even their grief over their infertility of wanting a child so desperately and not. I think I can speak for Lizzie and I when I say we're holding you all in our hearts. I'm also curious, looking back now, as the adult that you are, having gone through your own loss of a child, doing the work that you do, what did you notice about your mom's capacity or permission, in a way, self permission to grieve those losses herself? Because this was also in a very different era. I mean, grief was not, there were no podcasts about grief. Well, there was no podcast. There was no conversations. What do you look back and remember about your mom's, um, you know, not her own capacity, but the culture around her to grieve those losses?
That's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, we didn't talk about it too much. We
Yeah.
could talk about everything under the sun, but I had a sense that that pain was almost too much for her.
Mm.
And she was a very practical, pragmatic person who had dealt with a lot in her life, and she just sort of got on with it. But I
Yeah.
feel that she died 26 years ago, and I feel that because the grief world has changed so much even in that
S-
time, hasn't it?
I mean, it's changed in the last decade, I would
It
say,
really
profoundly.
has. I think the
Yeah.
last decade is
Yeah.
monumental in those terms. And the fact that
Yeah.
we've all met, we've met
Yes.
through wonderful events like Grieftastic. We've met through the call
Yeah.
we have every month together with others. And
Yes.
it's so wonderful what's happening. There can never be enough grief books as far as I'm concerned to recommend to clients. And
Yeah.
I'm just so happy that this is happening, but it was a very different world then. And I think she would be so immensely relieved. She was a great reader, and I think
Yeah.
she'd be so relieved at the way it is now compared to when she went through it. I really do. I remember her
Yeah.
telling me actually that when she was having a miscarriage at one point, she was put on a ward with people having abortions, and that's the sort of thing they just didn't think about in
Yeah.
those days, did they? It
Yeah.
was really
Yeah.
tough, I think. So I
Yeah.
really celebrate the way we can do it now.
Yeah. Well, and also I just like to think of your mom, maybe smiling that not only are there books out there about grief, but her own daughter wrote this gorgeous book, When Grief Equals Love, about grief. So just, um, yeah, just celebrating
Oh, thank
image,
you.
just, yeah, welcoming her here. Well, speaking of that book, here you had this backdrop of grief that you didn't even really kind of come to own or recognize or acknowledge until you were, a tween, or whatever we're calling 10-year-olds these days,
Mhm.
a young person. Um, but you, like so many of the guests on my show, went on to experience such a profound loss. And I wanted to invite you to share anything that you want to share about Harry's life, but also about Harry's death, and maybe a little bit about that early reckoning, or how you were processing grief early on, only because we're going to talk about long-term perspective, and just to help people understand that our experience with our grief changes over time. So, what might you want to share a little bit about Harry's story?
Oh, thanks, Lisa. Well, yes, Harry was my eldest son. He was born in 1994, and so he'd be 31 now.
Okay.
And he was fine until he was 17 months old. We did that thing of parents being so relieved that, the baby
Yes.
was here safely and healthy and all the rest of it. And he had his first health report said vigorous, healthy baby. And And then at 17 months, I had my second child, Cam, was 6 weeks old, and at 17 months, a health visitor came to visit Cam, and just did the normal standard 6 week health check,
Yeah.
and she happened to pick Harry up, and she said, "I don't think he's weight bearing properly on his legs," and because I
Mm.
didn't walk until I was about 2, I was just lazy. I think it was a bit of a family joke, so and new mum, you don't know what I
Yeah.
had
You don't know
no
what you don't know because you've
I
never
didn't
done
know
that
anything.
before. Yeah.
I knew nothing. So anyway, that she said, "I think he might just need to go and have some physio. We'll take him to we'll go to the hospital. We'll book an appointment, and hopefully it's just a matter of having some physio to get him going." We went for tests, and a week later we had a diagnosis that really, really shattered our whole world. And it was that he had spinal muscular atrophy, and it was a degenerative neuro condition that all our children had a 1 in 4 chance of having.
Mhm.
We both had a deleted gene that put together meant that this was the result. And so we had to have Cam, our second child, tested as well.
Yeah.
And thankfully, he was clear. But of
Yeah.
course, that was the weirdest thing in the world,
Yeah.
celebrating that one child was going to live when the other,
Yeah.
wasn't. Because
Yeah.
in those days, and I do need to make it clear, because there is medication now that can help spinal
Mm.
muscular atrophy. It's not a cure, but it can help delay some of the symptoms. And that was not available in those days. So actually, the diagnosis we were given, and this was, nearly 30 years ago, was that it was terminal and incurable and untreatable. Those were the 3 words that we used on diagnosis. Um, and we came home, and that was the start of a very, very different journey. I was working in television at the time in the UK. I'd just moved out to the countryside, to the Cotswolds, and with my husband, and we had a pretty idyllic life. And in that moment, those 3 words just shattered it completely.
Yeah.
So we started this journey of being carers. I couldn't go back to work. And our house was full of disability equipment, as so many of your listeners will
Yeah.
know and probably have experienced themselves in varying ways. And it's a tough gig. It really is. And a major life change. But my initial thoughts were, I think I was very aware that I started my grief in those moments. I was aware of anticipatory grief,
Yeah.
even if I couldn't name it, or living grief. I realized my first point of grief was that diagnosis.
Yeah.
But I also realized I wanted to learn everything I possibly could about how do we survive this as a family? How do I survive it personally? How do we give Harry the best life possible, and his brother Cam at the time? We went on to have another baby, Emily, who's now 27. And how do we give this family the best chance? And
Yeah.
how do we celebrate life? And immediately, as many of your listeners and you yourself know, Lisa, the the sort of hunger for life, the
Yeah.
knowledge and the realization that every single moment is precious hit me so hard, but in a wonderful way, really. So you go through that diagnosis, and it's the most devastating thing, but at the same time, your life almost seems enhanced because you stop worrying. You don't sweat the
Yeah.
small stuff, do you?
Or the medium or even the almost large stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then I suppose, I mean, this is something I talk a lot to my clients about, is you really find out who your friendships are, don't you? Who your
Yeah.
friends are, who are the family that can really walk the walk with you
Yeah.
and be alongside you. And those are very special friendships to this day. They really
Yeah.
are. I'm
Yeah.
26 years on now, and I well, 26 years on from Harry's death. He
Yeah.
he lived until he was 6.5.
Okay.
And we were very lucky to use a children's hospice in those years for respite care where we could all go and stay as a family. And they came into their own actually in the last year of Harry's life, which I've written extensively about in the
Yes.
book. And we had support from them. And I don't know what we'd have done without them, actually. That support was second to none.
Yeah, your championing and storytelling of children's hospice and just the role of hospice in your life, as you took care of Harry, I think is one of the many beautiful examples of why we need to be more supportive of and sort of shouting from the rooftops the power of hospice, not just
Yeah.
for the patient, not just for the individual, but of course for the family who loves them so that quality time can be spent. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
you named so much there, Lizzie. Thank you for bringing Harry a little bit into our minds and into our hearts. Is there a before I move on to some other questions, I have so many questions for you as always, but just always like to invite people to share just a quality that you or a memory or a feature about their loved one that we want the world to know. Is there something, and there's a million, I'm sure, with Harry, but is there something that comes to mind that feels important to share today about Harry?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a beautiful thing to ask. And yellow is what comes to mind. Harry loved the color yellow. Everything was yellow. And it sort of summed up his disposition in a way. He was
Okay.
very sunny. He just loved life. He absolutely loved life. He was a cup half full person, for sure.
Mm,
And that really helped him get through a lot, actually.
yeah. And I imagined you all too, in a way, to see that
Yeah.
spirit and for his young self to be a teacher to you about that kind of half full. And as you said, the lessons that you were learning as an adult in this uh, point where where those three words were uttered to you was just the the relief, and I mean that in an artistic term, and in that way that everything else that mattered sort of fades into the background, and what comes forward is the very preciousness of health and family time and friendships, and yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So gorgeous. So I know you went on to become very deeply involved in children's hospice, I think, in your work. And, and of course, as folks heard, you're a grief educator and you're an author. I wondered whether we might talk a little bit about the experience of interviewing people for when grief equals love, because it's not only your own story and the story of the involvement of hospice, but also what other people were learning and going through. Is there a
Mhm.
particular story or a particular interview that stands out for you today? I mean, they're all, I'm sure, wonderful, but is there something that's,
Yes, I
yeah.
think, I've got a copy of it
Yeah,
here,
thank
actually.
you. You all listeners
Okay.
know I'm usually up here with my flagged copy, and I left my flagged copy. It doesn't matter with a friend's house, so I don't have it here, but if you're
There it
watching us on
is.
YouTube, there's the gorgeous book.
But I think,
Yeah.
the key is in the tagline,
Yeah.
which is, long-term perspectives on living
Yeah.
with loss. And that to me felt really important because in all the reading I'd done, a lot of the books were about the first year of grief.
Yes. Yes.
And and I felt it was important to look back and reflect. And I actually it was during COVID that I did the 23 interviews with people on their long-term perspectives. And I felt because the first part of the book is my diaries for the first 7 years after Harry died, that it's observations of my younger children and how they coped, how we coped, and people around us coped. And it's me beginning to work at the Children's Hospice where I stayed for 12 years. And so that was part of that journey. But then I thought, I don't want it just to be our story. So to answer your question, there are two interviews that really stand out for me. And actually they're Cam and Emily, my children's
Mm.
interviews, because I felt so much of the early book was about their childhood. And really, I only wrote those diaries so that they might read them one day. If they wanted to, I felt it was important to record their grief for them because some of it would be before their
Yeah.
living memory.
Yeah.
but they nevertheless grieved so hard as small children, and I felt I wanted to bear witness to it for them.
Yes.
And so I felt the first 2 interviews I needed to do were them as adults. And
Yeah.
Emily's now 27 and Cam is 30. So those are the 2 that stand out. You know, that I think it's important for the reader to hear their story as children and then
Yeah.
hear what they feel as adults. And then I went on to interview people who worked at the hospice and some of the people I'd met there.
Yeah.
And also that it's not just bereaved parents in the interviews. I interviewed a refugee friend about his
Yeah.
flight from Sudan, his flight on feet, not in an airplane.
Yes. Yes.
I
Yes.
hasten to add, very, very tough journey. I interviewed another friend, Umu, about racial grief.
Yeah.
I interviewed a bereaved sibling who was bereaved by suicide, you know, and there's
Yeah.
parental
Yeah.
loss of parents, all sorts of different stories in there. But what I've really discovered, Lisa, and I know this will probably resonate for you and other people here, is that I find with my grief clients, it doesn't matter what their faith, their ethnicity, their neurodiversity, their age, their culture, their social situation. They can be from a very, very happy, close family with all the support in the world, but they still want to talk to me about the same themes. And those are the themes that I've really tried to pull out in the interviews in the book. Um,
Yeah.
Most people come up with the same things, don't they? Which are
Yeah.
very often time passing and
Yeah.
not healing. How do we connect to our loved ones when they've died? And the fear of not connecting to them and disconnecting is enormous, isn't it? That's what
Yeah.
creates the big void. And if we can
Yes.
connect to them, it's helpful. Friends walking away, the loneliness, you know.
Yeah.
So even in the closest of families, people can still feel lonely because they're grieving differently, can't they? And so
Yes.
I hope that there are some useful pointers about those through all these different stories.
Yeah. No, they're absolutely, absolutely. I loved the sort of depth and breadth of expansiveness of the kinds of stories, the kinds of losses, particularly kind of in this long view, as you're talking about sort
Yeah.
of the long arc of time. And this truth that while each of our grief is very individual based on all kinds of factors in our lives, there are these human through lines and
Yeah.
these human experiences that so many of us have in our grief, which to me feels like such, as a reader of your book or even hopefully listener of this conversation, brings comfort in a way that it's not just me, because I think
Yeah.
um, some of the discontent, some of the overwhelm, some of the deep-seated fear that we have in grief and the suffering that we experience in grief is the story that we have that it's just me, that there's something wrong with me, or there's something about my particular way I'm approaching grief or my particular loss. And that is such a lonely and isolating experience. And so I think there's so much beauty in what you're saying here and what you offer up to us in the book, which is, yes, your grief is unique and for you to grieve the way that is serves you most. And
Yeah.
you're part of this community of grievers too. And
Yeah.
I think that feels reassuring. My hope is that this show feels like a safe space to be inside your grief. Remember, you don't need to do this alone. Your grief is valid and a normal response to loss. And the truth is, we live in a grief illiterate culture, which makes navigating this process more challenging than it needs to be. As a narrative therapy trained social worker and student of grief education and ritual, I'm here to walk alongside you. I'll offer you a place to feel seen and held and help you discover skills and practices for being with both grief and joy. Let me be your guide. If you're interested in learning more about individual grief support with me, you can visit lisakeefauver.com after the show today. That's Lisa, Keefauver, ver.com.
Absolutely. And I find particularly that there's this thing, isn't there, that society, people who haven't been through a major loss, they tend to think that the first year has to be the worst, and that after that, that
Yeah.
they seem to think it's a sort of
Well, we want it to be sort of linear and going upward, ever upward,
yes.
onward. Yes.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
have a beginning and then it just gets better and better and better. And of course, it's not like that. It's so messy, isn't it? And
Yes.
non-linear. And so I think that makes it doubly hard for people, especially in years 2 and 3, possibly after a
Yes.
major loss. That can be a very lonely time, I think, when people's lives really are going back to normal and theirs isn't. And in fact, it's
Yes.
a gaping void very often, isn't it? Where they're just
Yeah.
thinking, I don't know whether I can actually
Do
do
this.
this.
Yeah.
And of course we can find the strength with good support and with the right people around us, but sometimes we have to go and find that.
Yeah.
And it's not always from your very good close friendships if they don't understand, is it? I spend
Yeah.
so much time encouraging people to find a group or to find good grief support, but to find even one person, if they're in their company at work, find
Yeah.
one person who's been through a major bereavement who you can connect with, and that can make all the difference in the
Yes.
workplace. It
Absolutely.
it doesn't
Absolutely.
always have to be a lot of people, but
Yeah.
somebody who understands what you're going through.
Absolutely, and not as the person who's gonna, air quotes, "solve your grief," but as a person who's gonna maybe very quietly be present to and acknowledge the complexity and the peculiarity and the heaviness and the both and that happens in your grief, and I agree there's, one of the many universal themes I see too with the clients that I work with is the sort of real surprise about the people that they thought would show up that didn't, and then the people who they never would have expected did show up. And that other surprise theme that I see often too that I'm, gently cautioning people with when I hear the sort of expectation of, "I just wanna get through year 1." Um, and I think, this idea that year 2 and 3 sometimes can be challenging. We could use the word more challenging or differently challenging. I don't wanna Again, it's not the same for everybody. Maybe you're listening and your year 2 was okay. I think the reasons that year 2 and year 3 are often so difficult are the same reasons that I cheekily use "Grief is a Sneaky Bitch" as a title, is that there's the story that we tell culturally about what grief looks like, which in this case is linear, and you just get through day by day, and each day you're incrementally less burdened or whatever term is by your grief, and that you move forward, but then your lived experience is very different. And it's that gap between the story and our experience. And the reason that has a huge impact to what you just said is year 2, people start to fade away. They go back to their normal lives. They're not checking in on you anymore because they also believe in the story that you've, like, ta-da, you made it to the anniversary and now you're on the other side. So I just love that so much of your work is helping us understand the long arc of grief. If someone is listening and let's say they're year 1 or maybe 2 or 3, are there some themes that you want them to know about what you've learned, not just from your own lived experience, but having interviewed and worked with so many people over time about what they might come to expect or anticipate in down the road? It could be years 7 or 10. I'll be 15 years this summer since the death of my husband, Eric, and, um, it's certainly a very different relationship I have with grief than I
Yeah.
did in year 2. What are some themes that might be important for people to know?
And it's not even with grief, Lisa, is it? It's with him potentially.
Yes.
I have a
Yes.
different relationship with Harry than I had 25, 26 years ago. And
Yes.
I think that the biggest thing I love to work with is continuing bonds, as so many of
Yes.
the big fans of this theory
Yes.
in the grief space. And, you know, of course, it's the notion that we can continue the relationship with our loved one after they've died. And I always find it's a very, very well, not difficult balance, but it's very important to find the balance, isn't it? Because at the
Yeah.
beginning, it can be too painful to connect
Yes.
to the person who's died. And
Yeah.
especially if somebody's been through trauma around their death and they're going through reliving those end moments
Yes.
and all of those things, it can be too soon, sometimes even in year
Yes.
one, to start connecting to them. And I have quite a lot of exercises I do with people, written exercises to help them connect, you know,
Yes.
and we talk about, you know, what are the ways you best connect to them now? What are the words that spring to mind when you think about your loved one? And they're beautiful exercises to do, but you can't do them too soon
No.
because they're
Yeah.
too painful. But in years 2 and 3, to answer your question, I think
Yeah.
that, you know, that's the most wonderful time to start reconnecting as best you can. And I was doing some work actually recently with somebody whose, father had died when they were 9, and I'm working with this person, I won't gender them,
Yeah. Yeah.
with them, 20 years on. And they'd heard me
Yeah.
speak at a conference and asked if they could have some one-to-one support, and they'd never, ever, ever had any support
Yeah.
over the death of that parent in all those years. And they were doing well. They're working for a
Yeah.
great company, they've got married, they're doing really well, but the talk had triggered quite a lot and
Yeah.
made them
Yeah.
realize that there was a disconnect there, and they were really fearful of being disconnected from that parent.
Yeah.
And, having not had the support, and we've been doing the most beautiful work on continuing bonds, and those memories are so strong for that client,
Yeah.
even though they've been through a couple of decades without being able to really think about the parent and,
Yeah.
you know, getting on with their lives as best they could. It's so incredible. I had one client who was 40 years on from the death
Yeah.
of
Yep.
their loved one,
Yep.
and we still were able to connect so strongly to the person they'd loved. And that's the absolute joy of continuing bonds, isn't it? Doing that work
Yes.
with people, bringing those memories back. And I feel it's such a privilege because actually when I start to work with people, we I feel such a I see such a picture of this
Yeah.
person they've loved. It's
Yes.
like bringing
Yeah.
them into the room and bringing them back again, and the joy on their faces through the tears. There's also
Yes.
great joy at being able to connect. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, we both know and love Mary Frances O'Connor and her
Yes.
book, The Grieving Brain, and she talks so much about how not only can we connect, but we can evolve the relationship, and the
Yeah.
relationship changes as our perspectives change on the death, on the loss, on the life of that person, and on our own lives. So we evolve and they evolve with us. And that's the most beautiful idea, isn't it? And that's comforting,
Yeah.
much more than words like closure. It's
Ugh.
about connection, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Oh, Lizzie, there's so much wisdom you just offered us there. And I want to amplify a few of the key themes and just explore them in a little more depth with you. And oh, my mind body is sort of reverberating there. I want to go back to something that you said sort of early on in this and in this part of the conversation, which is early on in our grief, our relationship with our person, I'm gonna use the word rightly so, or of course, is so connected to the with the way they died. Whether or not it was traumatic or not, but our relationship, our connection to them is really about their ending, around their death. And so this idea of being able to be continuing bonds or even turn towards our memories or turn towards our relationship with them can feel like too much too fast
Yeah.
because it's only we've sort of shrunk down all of our relationship and our memories to that ending time. It's like for me, my husband was misdiagnosed for a year, and he became a very radically different and difficult person in that last year. And then the death was so sudden that early my memories, my being in relationship with Eric was so
Mm.
intensely complicated because it was so connected to that ending time.
Yeah.
And one of the beautiful things that I discovered over time was the way that I got to get to um, be able to see more broadly, which was just impossible to do in the beginning. So I don't even have any judgment against that version of me, to sort of zoom up and out and be able to see the expansiveness of a relationship while he was in life, while he was living, and then how we get to then cultivate, as you said, our relationship with our person. I think sometimes I use that interchangeably. One of the things that I invite people to do in my one-on-one work is to be in relationship with your grief, which is to say to be in relationship with your person if it's a death loss. But it might even be true about other kinds of losses, non-death losses as well. And what a welcome invitation to those of us who grew up in a culture who were told closure is the goal, hurry up and get on. And then we just cling more tightly. I think actually that's part of what gets people what we often label stuck, which I personally hate that label and do not trade in
So
that
do
language
I.
at all. I think it's offensive and problematic. And yet I think sometimes people behave in sticky ways. I'll just say it like that, because they feel that they've been told their only choice is to cling desperately or shut the door completely on their relationship with the
Mm.
person.
Yeah.
And so what if we remind all of us that we get to cultivate a relation. I could talk to Eric every day. I still do talk to him every day. Then we maybe wouldn't cling so tight. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how you work with somebody who feels that sort of pressure of, because maybe it's been 3 years or 5 years, or maybe they are coming to you 20 years later, which, by the way, it's never too late to grieve and never too late to enrich the relationship that you have with your person who's died. And they're telling you they're getting messages that they're stuck, that it's time to move on, that's closure. How are you working with that person? If a listener is in a similar situation, what might they hear from you? I'm
Oh,
curious. And I have my own strategies that I use, but I'm curious
I
how
mean,
you're showing up.
it makes me so angry on their behalf when they've been
Yeah.
told that they're stuck endlessly, or they should be doing better, or they should be moving on. And the number of family members, even, and friends that
Oh,
say this to
it's
people.
often mostly, I think, family members and friends. Yes.
Yeah, and it's so harsh, isn't it? Because they're just grieving naturally. And
Yeah.
even GPs, the number of GPs and psychiatrists that medicate people
Oh,
when they're just grieving naturally, it drives me nuts.
okay. I'm high-fiving you through the screen on this one.
Yeah,
I
me
am
too.
right
Here we
there
go.
with you. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and I feel for them, and the relief that I see on their
Yeah.
faces when I just say to them, I don't think you're stuck. I think you are going through natural grief. Let's examine it. Let's investigate it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
for starters, sometimes when you go to speak at something and people say, "Oh,
Yes.
the grief expert," I always say,
Ugh.
"Please don't call me that. I like to be called a grief investigator." That's my favorite
Yes.
title, because
Yeah.
we never stop
No.
investigating, do we? We never stop processing. I'm
Yeah.
25 years on from Harry's death, and I am still
Yeah.
processing. And that's not a scary thing, is it?
No.
I always want to say to people, I don't want to put fear into you that I'm 25 years on
Yeah.
and still processing. It's just a natural thing. You incrementally and slowly adjust to living with the
Yeah.
knowledge of what's happened. And if we can
Absolutely. Well,
do that,
and you're living a life, and so each new life
yes.
experience is laying a new layer of perspective that you're having. And what a unfulfilling life to lack curiosity.
Yeah.
Right? And so to me, I know I feel the same way. I have so much rage. I'll specifically say, don't introduce me that way. And then I just happened to me the other day. I gave a keynote in Houston and they were like, grief expert. And I was like, I don't want to correct you. I call myself a grief activist because I'm trying to sort of
Great.
activate how we reimagine grief. That's the work that I
Yeah.
do.
And we
But to
stay
your point,
curious,
you
don't
stay
we? We
curious.
stay curious. And that's the key, actually, to
Yeah.
answer your question about
Yeah.
what would I say to those people who come at 2 or 3 years on. It's about curiosity. It's about
Yeah.
investigating. It's excavating. Together we can excavate every layer of grief and see what's inside and then work out what to do with it. And
Yes.
some of the added grief is from other people and it's not ours to grieve, is it? There are layers added
Exactly.
on, I think, from other people's perceptions. And so it is often drilling down and finding those connections to the person, working out how do you want to curate your life now? That's my favorite question. And I love the word curate.
Yeah.
How are we going to curate our lives now that we're going through this? We're at this stage of our grief. What do we want to do?
Yeah.
How are we feeling? What's our perception of how we want to live now?
Yeah.
How do
What are
we
the
want to work
rituals? What
now?
are the conversations?
Yeah.
How are we going to carry the person? Maybe differently. We carry them with us
Yeah.
differently in year 10 than we did in year 7. You named curating, and I had our mutual friend Charlene Lamb on the show earlier this season. And of course, we talked a lot about that. And I love that idea. And I think you and I have talked about this probably off air. I don't think we talked about it earlier today, but part of that curating or that curiosity and the relief people feel is I think often can talk about the ways in which we try to have the myth of closure is that something happens in chapter 1 and then in that chapter, let's say somebody we love dies, and then they try to tell us, but when you go to chapter 2, it's as if you have to start fresh. But have any of us ever read a book where even when something pivotally turns around, we forget the fact that the character, part of who that character is in chapter 22 is because of what they went through in chapter 1.
Yeah.
And so I often use that metaphor when I'm working with one-on-one clients, which is like, maybe you're not living day to day in chapter 1 anymore, right? The details, the caring for Harry in that time or the time that I had with Eric between diagnosis and his death, which was 2.5 weeks. Um,
So
but
fast, Lisa.
so fast. And that that informs the relationship, the conversation I have with Eric. It informs the who I am showing up today, having this conversation with you. It's not the only thing because new lived experiences happen. Chapters 2 through 22 have happened,
Yeah.
in the interim. And I hear you in that. I think I think that perspective that you just named is so important because so often people have that same reaction that you just named, which is like, ooh, I don't want to hear that 25 years on, you're still experiencing or processing your grief. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, but let me tell you, being in conversation with my grief or processing my grief or whatever language means I'm getting to be in relationship with my person and
Yeah.
discover things about the world and see the world in a way that I never would have got to if I wasn't staying curious. More than ever, my friends, I'm passionate about creating meaningful community and offering you more insight into my work and even into my life, too. I want a place to explore topics in depth, expand my creative expressions through things like long form essays and even maybe some audio and video guided practices. I want to be able to share some behind the scenes moments from the podcast and maybe even eventually host a Dear Lisa column. Most importantly, I want to build an authentic, interactive community off social media. Life is happening so fast, and I want a place where we can slow down, dive deeper, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. That's why I launched my Substack, AFGO with Lisa Keefauver. Now, if you haven't heard me talk about it in my book or from the stage or maybe even here on the podcast, AFGO stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yes, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. Rest assured, my friends, like in all my work, I'll show up authentically, offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. I really look forward to your comments, our chats, creating special audio and video content for you, and more. And if you'd like things delivered to your inbox, don't worry, AFGO with Lisa Keefauver will come directly to you. You can sign up after today's episode at afgowithlisakefauver.substack.com. You can find it in the show notes, or if that's all too much, just head to my website, lisakeefauver.com.
Absolutely. You just made me think, Lisa, of there's a beautiful Einstein quote, which I've abridged massively, but I use it as adversity introduces you to the real you.
Mhm.
And, that's such a beautiful quote because we don't want to go through adversity. None of us want to go through
No.
this, do we? We'd do
No.
anything to change it, but we can't. And
Yeah.
that's a lot of the work I've done on myself and on others is, what can we change and what
Yeah.
can't we change? And let's
Yes.
work on the things we can change and find
Yes.
acceptance, if possible, for the things that we can't change. And
Yeah.
let's find the courage to move forward with our loved ones and with our
Yes.
perspectives. And we're all the sum of everything we've been through, aren't
Yeah.
we? And adversity introduces you to the real you. When people can find that strength to go forward with their
Yeah.
grief, with themselves, having exposed so much more about themselves and having
Yeah.
delved really deep. There's an objective part of me that has found this whole journey so fascinating.
Yes.
And especially the people we've met along the way, all the people in the children's hospice that I've met and you and all the wonderful people in the States who I've met now. We have our regular monthly
Yes.
meetings, and there are so many of us who are individuals in the grief space who've been through so much ourselves, but
Yeah.
we're still curious and we're still processing. And that's a wonderful thing. I lead a happy life now, but
Yeah.
I live with grief. And that's
Right.
the bottom line.
Yeah. I would just offer, because listeners know, if you've listened to this show before or you've seen me on stage talking about my tattoo, I would say I live a happy life and I still experience grief. And I think part of what so much of your writing and your work, part of this conversation today, the notion of continuing bonds and exploring the long-term perspective of grief is pushing back against the sort of toxically positive either or um, kind of culture that we've created, which travels across the pond and around the globe, unfortunately, of sort of this or that, which feeds into this idea that you have to move on and that there's closure and that you can't possibly be have joy and grief, which of course you absolutely can. And I also think it leads to dangerous things like everything happens for a reason and other cliches, or you're so strong, I don't know how you do it. And those kind of backhanded, people think they're being complimentary or helpful, but really are being insulting.
Yeah.
And because they flatten or try to flatten your lived experience to like either you can be grateful or you can be grieving what you've lost.
Yeah.
Either you can be resilient or you can need a break. And my argument, and I suspect is yours too, is both of those things can be true. And the minute you stop trying to resist or deny one, you get to move between the
Yeah.
both resiliency and needing a break, both the gratitude. I think that one's a big one, the sort of grateful, because you hear that all the time. Well, at least you had X number of years, or I've heard all the time, well, at least you got to have an amazing love. And I do. I am beyond grateful that I got to love and be loved by Eric. And
And it wasn't
I
long
deep
enough.
and it wasn't long enough, and even if you're grieving your 99-year-old parent dying, it might feel not long enough. So
Absolutely.
how do you think about the power of and maybe you haven't put it in those terms before, but how do you think about the power of the and as a tool for as we move forward into the, like, the decades maybe, or into the later years of our grief? What does
I and
yeah.
for me, this might sound a bit odd, but and for me represents old-fashioned weighing scales. And,
Yes.
like with the balancing.
Yes.
So that's what it represents to me. So it's sorrow and joy
Yeah.
side by side. And for me, at the beginning of my grief, those two were polar opposites. It was
Exactly.
sorrow down here and joy up here. And as the years have passed, they've come together and they now balance each other. And on one
Yeah.
day, one might be a little off kilter, and on
Yeah.
another day, the other
Yeah.
might be, but they balance each other and they live side by side. So that's the and for me, is that mostly I see the and words as balancing each other. And
I
and
love
that's a good
that.
thing. They're side by side, most of those words. And that's
Yeah.
how I feel
There
about
are
them.
companions. I mean, I think all of
Yeah.
those things, the grief and the sorrow and the rage and the anger and the longing and the joy and the awe and the wonder,
Yeah.
they're all our companions in life, which is to say there are companions in grief, because we grief is a part of what it means to be human. This is part of our human inheritance. I think I've heard others say. And I wanted to amplify something you said there, Lizzie, too, which I think is the important, is sometimes we think so maybe somebody might grasp onto the idea of okay, I can be grief and be grateful. I can be resilient and need a break, right? I can have grief and joy. Then we try to make it so that they are equal and that old-fashioned timey scale is balanced all the time. So like in the morning, I let myself be sad. So this afternoon, I have to be making my gratitude list, right? Like we still try to make it live happening all the time. And the truth is there are going to be days, weeks, months, seasons where for the most part, one might be, and it might be the other way too. There might be seasons where we have a lot of joy up here and a lot of grief down here. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm sort of separating my hands here. Um, or it might vacillate up and down within any given day. And I think to honor the fact that wherever it is on that balancing scale is wherever it needs to be. I invite clients often to just take an inventory. Where are we in that balance?
Yeah.
And then with that awareness, you can make a choice. Yes, that could be a tool. You know what? I'm noticing I'm really carrying grief down here and it's feeling like a lot. And I'd like to figure out how to bring joy in. And so now I'm going to be intentional about some of
Yeah.
the ways I'm spending my time. So I think it can be a useful thing to pay attention to so that you can make some shifts, not because
Yeah.
it's wrong to have a hard feeling, but because maybe you want to see if you can do something to bring yourself into balance. Tell me a little bit about how you work with clients to first maybe be okay with the fact that it's not balanced, but then to find some strategies to maybe find a little more balance. Yeah.
I think often it's so practical, isn't it? These
Yeah.
solutions are so practical. I don't mean solutions to grief, obviously. I mean, that's
Yes.
as bad as closure for me, solution
Yeah.
based.
Yeah.
But solutions to these incremental challenges that we come
Yes.
across. And, sometimes it could be accept. I have clients, as you do, I'm sure, who are finding it so hard not to feel guilt when they feel
Yes.
happiness. And,
Yeah.
they may go out for dinner with some friends and find themselves laughing and then realize somebody they know is looking at them in the restaurant and then they feel guilty. I mean, I've been there.
I've
I
shared
re-
that story on this show before. Yeah. We've all been
yeah.
there, I think. Yeah.
It's so hard, isn't it? And you think, oh my goodness, the funeral was 6 weeks ago and now I'm laughing with a friend somewhere
Yeah.
and someone's caught me laughing. And
Yeah.
this happens all the time, doesn't it? And I just urge them to think, if you were that friend, wouldn't you be so happy to see them laughing
Yes.
and to see you laughing, and if they're
Yeah.
not happy to see you laughing, then they're not your friend. And equally
Period.
with tears, celebrate the tears. Let the tears out. It's part of the excavation process, isn't it? Getting these
Yeah.
tears out of our system. The release to our nervous system when we can cry is so good.
Yeah.
So it's celebrating the laughter and the tears. And so, I urge people to find this balancing act of finding the right people, accepting it might not be your best friends who can be right there for you. So find
Yeah.
new people. It could be through a grief cafe. It could be through a grief group. It could be somebody you already know, but you don't know them very well, but you know that they have been through something major.
Yeah.
So you'd like to reach out to them. I really encourage people to
Yeah.
do that. And not to think, oh, well, they may be doing better than me. They
Yes.
probably aren't at all. And maybe they
Right.
were a more confident person when you first knew them. And you think, well, no, they're going to be finding it easier than me. It's never like that. So it's
Yeah.
reaching out to the right people and really sort of finding the right people to be with. And I do an exercise where I get people to put themselves at at the center of a circle
Yeah.
and put the people around them in the circle who write the names of those people who are really there for them. And the
Yeah.
other thing I get people to say after almost every sentence that comes out of their mouths sometimes is for
Yeah.
now.
For now. I
This
knew
is
you were going to
how
say that because I use that too. I love that. For now.
it's
Say
so
more about why that
important.
matters. Yeah.
Because grief changes, as we know. And, those people who can be there for you now, these people who
Yeah.
you've found, who are there for you now. And it's meant that you've slightly had to shelve some of your best friends, possibly
Yeah.
because they cannot be there for you now. They simply don't understand.
Yeah.
You've gone to a different country and you've come back
Yeah.
speaking a different language.
Yeah.
And they don't speak that language, but there are these other people you don't know so well who do speak that language, and
Yeah.
they can be there speaking it with you now.
Yeah.
Later, hopefully, those good friends will still be there for you. But this exercise of naming the people and doing
Yeah.
some different versions of that circle, because it may be a work circle around your name with
Yeah.
those people who can be there for you, a home circle, a family circle. It may not be a circle. It might be
Yeah.
one person, actually. Maybe it's just a
Yep.
list. But I think the circle idea is important because these circles around us change throughout our
Yeah.
lives as people come and go. And people can come back into the circle too. So, it's an important exercise to do, and it's part of this sort of acceptance that things have changed
Yeah.
and will continue to change, changes in our lives, but it's not always bad. And
Yeah.
how great that there are these people for now.
Now.
But the for now sentence is so important. I don't want to join you for dinner for now. I
Yeah.
can't manage it. But please keep inviting me because I
Yes.
hope I won't always feel like this. This is how I feel for now. These words are
Yeah.
so important.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that phrase up, Lizzie. And I use it daily. By the way, not just with my clients, I use it with myself when I'm going through a wave of grief, when a new obstacles or series, certainly when I was going through cancer treatment recently over these
Yeah.
past few years, I used for an hours and or today to the end of every sentence. And it's such an important reminder because change is the only constant in life and certainly in grief. All emotions come and move through us and change. Because I think so much of the places where we get into despair, where we get into a sense of deep stuckness, when we get into a deep sense of hopelessness, is because we internalize a story that this is how it's always been and this is how it will always be. And unfortunately, we can't control what has always be, including, by the way, the last time you felt extreme joy. If we could hang on to something and keep it forever, we would have, and we just can't. And so I think saying for us grievers to say to ourselves, for now or for today or for this moment is so powerful. And if you're listening as a grief supporter, you're a colleague of somebody at work. I know we both go into the workplaces to do grief education at the workplace, or it's a neighbor, or it's your best friend, or it's somebody you are just getting to know. When you check in, you might check in instead of saying, "How are you?" which I really would like us to abolish as a question to ask grievers, is something like, how heavy is your grief today? Or what do you want me to know about that other people don't know about what your grief feels like right now? And just in the asking with the for now or today or in this moment, we're showing you, I get that no matter what your answer is right now, it's valid and true, and that it changes. Because I'm curious if you experienced this maybe as an early grieving mom, a early bereaved mom, or you've maybe witnessed this with your clients, and you alluded to it about the party thing. I think sometimes people are hesitant to say they're having an okay day or a good day or they're smiling because they worry that then people will now hold them accountable that this is the new threshold.
Yeah.
That like this
Yeah.
is the new normal and anything that isn't this is going backwards
Yeah. And a failure.
and a failure. Oh, you were doing so great and now you're back. And so, because again, it comes back to that linear story. So I catch clients all the time using that language on themselves and I sort of interrupt it. I'm curious what you notice about um, the sort of expectation of, or the willingness of people to be present with a good day for fear that that's now the new benchmark for which people are gonna hold them accountable.
Yeah. I
Or did
I
you feel that early on as a mom?
I yeah, I think I did. I I I felt a sort of guilt about being caught being happy,
Yes.
and I did feel that, and I remember something that my grief support from Helen Douglas House, the children's hospice we'd used. I was so lucky. I had 2 years of grief support after Harry died, and my grief support worker came to my house one day, and she said to me, "Lizzie, I think what you might find is that those tsunamis of grief that you're going through," which was in the early days, which you never know when they're gonna hit you, do you?
No.
They can be in one day, you might have many of them,
Yeah.
and another day you might not, and I remember in those times, I think, "Gosh, I cannot imagine feeling that bad again, that gut-wrenching sorrow." And then it would come again, and I think in those moments, I think, "I can't imagine ever feeling okay again." And she
Yeah.
said, "I think they'll get further apart. You
Yeah.
may find that in the coming months and years, those tsunamis of grief will get further apart, and you'll have more still waters in between." And that's
Yeah.
exactly what happened. Over
Yeah.
time, they were further apart. They'd still hit, but they were further
Yeah.
apart. And
Yeah.
now they're very rare. I can still have some very intense moments, if I look at a photo for too long or a memory really crops up and I delve deep back into it, it feels like it was yesterday. But on the whole, I can live
Yeah.
a very contented life, and those tsunamis of grief don't really happen anymore. And
Yeah.
and that's such a relief. And now, that's why I called my book When Grief Equals Love, because originally I was going to call it A Grief Endured, because every single day felt like an endurance test, and it was a nod to a very cheeky and inappropriate nod to C.S. Lewis's The Grief Observed, which is one of my
Yeah. Yeah.
favorite books ever.
Yes.
But
C.S.
I
Lewis,
called it A
yeah.
Grief Endured, and it was only actually because I'd edited it 15 years on from Harry's death, and it was still a grief endured
Yes.
then. But then when I edited it 23 years on, I thought,
Yeah.
"No, it's When
Yeah.
Grief Equals Love. It's all about love now."
Yeah.
And when I think of Harry, it is all about my love for him and not about the pain and not about his death. And that's what changes over the years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it
It
becomes
really
more about
is.
love. And actually, as the pain moves out and dissipates, hopefully because you're having good grief support and support from your
Yeah.
friends and family, and you're doing all the things to find the right people to be around you, then as that happens, you allow love back in because the
Yeah.
pain dilutes and dissipates, and it was taking up a lot of room.
Yeah.
And it had to. You know, it needs to be there in the early days. We need to grieve deeply. It's part of the process. But once it begins to shift, shape shift maybe, it
Yeah.
allows the love back in. And now I would say, you know, that's what I'm full of now for my son Harry and for my other children and for other people in my life is that it's all about love and not so much about pain. And that's
Yeah.
what I hope we can help people get to.
What a gorgeous, gorgeous way to end our conversation today, Lizzie. Thank you so much for inviting us to honor the pain, to honor our relationship with our person, and to honor the opportunity to allow love to be so present in our lives. I might say that that was felt so far off to me in my early grief, the idea of love that I've shared recently in my Substack. And just maybe we'll offer this as a closing today, a mantra that I say every day so that love could be center in my life when it felt so distant, which, if you're listening early in your grief, love might feel so far away. So, to everyone listening, to you, Lizzie, I want to offer, may you see love, may you feel love, may you radiate love, and may you receive love. Thank you, Lizzie, for joining me on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast today. What an absolute delight.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for everything you do. I'm so moved by that. I love those words. However many times I hear you say them, they still move me every single time. So please keep saying them.
I will. I will. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Bye. Wow, what a beautiful conversation. Do you agree? I so appreciate Lizzie's thoughtfulness, her insights and practical advice, and the reassurance she offers all of us that our grief changes over time. And while the grief is always here, the pain diminishes and makes room for love. This conversation reminded me of one I had a few years ago with another mother whose child died from a neurodegenerative disease and who also tends with such beauty and care to her relationship with them and to ensuring no one grieves alone. That episode is called Being with the Both and, with my guest and friend Myra Sack, founder of eMotion. Please give it a listen and also check out the work eMotion is doing too. Now, I hope you learned something new, felt seen or acknowledged in your own grief, or feel more equipped to show up for someone grieving the death of their loved one. If you loved this episode, we'd so appreciate it if you took just a few minutes to head to the Grief is a Sneaky Bitch show page on Apple Podcast, leave a 5-star rating, and then write a review about what the show meant to you. Until next time, my friends, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.